Welcome to Brain Upgrade. Before we begin, I want you to consider one simple question. How much of your life has been controlled by reactions you wish you could take back? One impulsive text, one emotional argument, one desperate explanation, and suddenly you've given away something far more valuable than your words. You've given away your peace. Today, we're going to explore why the strongest people aren't the ones who always fight back. They're the ones who know exactly when not to. So eliminate every distraction, stay with me until the end, because what you're about to learn could permanently change the way you handle criticism, conflict, and emotional pressure. Let's begin. Imagine someone says something about you that is unfair. Maybe they question your ability, criticize your decisions, or completely misunderstand your intentions. Within a fraction of a second, something happens inside your nervous system before you've even consciously decided how to respond. Your heart rate shifts, your breathing becomes slightly faster, muscles around your jaw, neck, and shoulders tighten, and your attention locks onto the source of the perceived threat. This isn't a character flaw. It's not a lack of discipline. It's the way the human brain has evolved to detect anything that could potentially affect survival or social standing. The important point is that your brain doesn't distinguish perfectly between physical danger and psychological discomfort. A harsh comment, public criticism, rejection, or disrespect can activate many of the same biological systems that were originally designed to keep humans alive in dangerous environments. Thousands of years ago, reacting immediately to a threat often increased the chances of survival. Speed mattered more than precision. But in modern life, reacting instantly to every emotional trigger rarely produces the best outcome. In fact, it often creates problems that didn't exist before the reaction itself. This is where one of the most valuable abilities of the human brain begins to reveal itself. Between the stimulus and your behavior, there is a brief window. Most people never notice it because it happens so quickly. Yet that tiny gap determines whether you're operating from impulse or from intention. The people who appear calm under pressure are not individuals who never experience emotion. Their nervous systems react just like everyone else's. The difference is that they have strengthened the ability to delay action long enough for the thinking parts of the brain to evaluate what is actually happening. Think about what usually happens during an argument. One person raises their voice and almost immediately the other person does the same. One accusation leads to another. Each reaction fuels the next until neither person is responding to facts anymore. They're simply responding to each other's emotional state. The conversation becomes less about solving a problem and more about protecting the ego. In biological terms, two nervous systems begin amplifying one another. Instead of reducing stress, each reaction increases it. Now imagine a different scenario. Someone attempts to provoke you, expecting an immediate response. Instead of speaking right away, you pause. You take one slow breath. You allow your body to settle before your mind decides what comes next. That pause may last only a few seconds, but something remarkable has already happened. You've interrupted the automatic chain of events. Rather than allowing emotion to dictate behavior, you've created space for deliberate choice. Every time you practice this process, you're teaching your brain something extremely important. You're reinforcing the neural circuits responsible for self-control. Like any biological system, these circuits become more efficient with repetition. The first few times you resist reacting, it may feel uncomfortable. Your body will still generate the urge to defend yourself, argue, or prove your point. That's normal. Those impulses are deeply wired into human biology. But impulses are not commands. They are signals, and signals do not have to determine behavior. One of the greatest misconceptions about emotional strength is that it means suppressing feelings. That's not what effective self-regulation looks like. Suppression often keeps the body in a prolonged state of stress because the emotion is still active beneath the surface. Real control comes from recognizing the emotional response, allowing it to exist without immediately acting on it, and then choosing behavior based on long-term goals rather than short-term relief. Consider how often people regret something they said in the heat of the moment. Minutes later, when the nervous system returns to a calmer state, they see the situation differently. The facts haven't changed. What changed was the biological state of the brain. Under high emotional arousal, attention narrows, judgment becomes less flexible. The mind searches for immediate solutions instead of accurate ones. This is why decisions made during intense anger, fear, or frustration often conflict with the values a person holds when they are calm. There's another layer to this that is often overlooked. Every reaction teaches your brain what deserves attention. If you respond emotionally to every criticism, every insult, every disagreement, your nervous system gradually becomes more sensitive to those experiences. It begins anticipating conflict, even where none exists. Small inconveniences start feeling like major threats because the brain has learned that these situations demand immediate action. Over time, this creates a cycle where emotional reactivity becomes the default rather than the exception. The opposite is also true. Every time you choose not to react impulsively, you send a different message to your brain. You communicate that not every challenge requires immediate engagement. Not every opinion deserves your emotional investment. Not every moment of discomfort is an emergency. Gradually, your nervous system becomes more stable. Situations that once triggered intense reactions begin to lose their power. You still notice them, but they no longer control your behavior. This is why true composure is not something people are born with. It is something they repeatedly practice until it becomes part of their biology. The strongest individuals are not those who never feel anger, frustration, or disappointment. They are the ones who understand that emotions provide information, but they do not automatically deserve action. They recognize that the highest level of self-control isn't eliminating emotion. It's refusing to let temporary feelings make permanent decisions. When you master that ability, your greatest advantage is no longer your intelligence, your talent, or your words. It becomes your capacity to remain steady while everyone else is reacting. That is where real strength begins. Think about how much of your day is spent inside conversations that never actually happen. Someone makes a comment, sends a message, overlooks your contribution, or questions one of your decisions, and long after the interaction ends, your mind continues replaying it. You imagine better responses. You rehearse explanations. You construct arguments that you'll probably never say out loud. From the outside, you're sitting quietly, but inside, your brain is investing an enormous amount of energy into defending an image of yourself. This tendency is deeply human because the brain is fundamentally wired to care about social evaluation. For most of human history, belonging to a group wasn't simply desirable, it was essential for survival. Being accepted meant access to protection, resources, and cooperation. Being rejected carried significant risks. As a result, the nervous system evolved to pay extraordinary attention to how other people perceive us. Even today, criticism can feel disproportionately powerful because your brain often interprets it as more than just an opinion. It interprets it as a potential threat to social security. This is why the urge to explain yourself can feel almost irresistible. When someone misunderstands your intentions, your brain immediately begins searching for ways to restore certainty. It tells you that if you simply choose the right words, provide enough details, or clarify your motives one more time, the discomfort will disappear. Sometimes that's true. Genuine misunderstandings can often be resolved with honest communication. But many situations are fundamentally different. They aren't driven by a lack of information. They're driven by differences in perception, emotion, or expectation. Once someone has formed a strong opinion, additional explanations often produce diminishing returns. Instead of creating clarity, they can invite more debate, more interpretation, and more emotional investment. You find yourself explaining not because the other person is genuinely seeking understanding, but because your own nervous system is seeking relief. That's a critical distinction. You're no longer communicating to inform. You're communicating to reduce the discomfort created by uncertainty. The challenge is that relief obtained through constant explanation is usually temporary. The brain quickly learns a pattern. Whenever discomfort appears, explain yourself until it fades. But because life continually presents new disagreements, new misunderstandings, and new opinions, the cycle repeats. Over time, your sense of emotional stability becomes increasingly dependent on other people's responses. If they accept your explanation, you feel calm. If they reject it, your mind immediately searches for another argument. In this way, your internal state becomes linked to factors that you cannot fully control. One of the remarkable properties of attention is that whatever consistently occupies it becomes increasingly significant in the brain. Neural circuits strengthen through repeated activation. If your thoughts repeatedly return to defending yourself, your brain becomes more efficient at detecting situations that require defense. Eventually, it begins anticipating criticism before it even occurs. Neutral comments start sounding personal. Silence feels like judgment. Ordinary disagreements feel like attacks. Not because the world has become more hostile, but because your attentional system has been trained to search for evidence that confirms its expectations. Now consider the opposite approach. Imagine someone misunderstands one of your decisions. You evaluate whether the misunderstanding actually affects something important. If it does, you provide a clear, concise explanation and then allow the conversation to end. If it doesn't, you resist the urge to continue justifying yourself. At first, this feels uncomfortable because your brain still wants certainty. It wants complete agreement. But certainty from other people is rarely available. Learning to tolerate that uncertainty is one of the defining characteristics of emotional maturity. Another important factor is cognitive energy. Your brain operates with finite attentional resources. Every decision, every emotional conflict, every internal debate consumes mental capacity. When you spend hours replaying conversations or constructing explanations for people who have already decided what they believe, you're allocating cognitive resources that could have been directed toward learning, creating, solving problems, or improving your own life. Attention is not an unlimited resource. Wherever you consistently place it, something else loses access to it. High-performing individuals often appear mentally disciplined not because they encounter fewer distractions, but because they make deliberate decisions about what deserves prolonged attention. They recognize that explaining themselves endlessly rarely changes outcomes proportionally to the energy invested. Instead, they preserve that energy for actions that produce measurable progress. Their confidence comes less from convincing everyone else and more from maintaining alignment between their actions and their values. There's also an interesting shift that occurs when your behavior consistently reflects your principles. Over time, your actions begin communicating more effectively than your explanations. People observe patterns. They notice reliability, consistency, discipline, and integrity. Those qualities are difficult to fake and impossible to establish through words alone. In many cases, repeated behavior quietly answers questions that endless conversation never could. Silence in this context is not avoidance. It is restraint guided by intention. It reflects the understanding that communication is most effective when it serves a purpose rather than satisfying an impulse. Sometimes the strongest message is delivered by allowing your actions to continue uninterrupted while others remain occupied with opinions. The goal is not to stop caring about what anyone thinks. Human beings are social by nature, and healthy relationships require communication, empathy, and openness. The goal is to recognize the point at which explanation stops being productive and starts becoming emotional dependency. When you no longer feel compelled to justify every decision, defend every criticism, or correct every misunderstanding, something important changes inside your nervous system. Your attention returns to what you can influence. Your energy becomes available for meaningful work. And gradually, your sense of identity shifts away from needing constant external validation towards something far more stable, confidence built on consistent action rather than continuous explanation. Consider what happens when your attention is captured by something negative. Someone posts an insulting comment, spreads a rumor, dismisses your effort, or behaves in a way that feels deeply unfair. In many cases, the event itself lasts only a few seconds, yet the experience continues long after it is over because your brain keeps returning to it. Hours later, you're still thinking about it. Before going to sleep, it reappears. The next morning, it's one of the first thoughts that enters your mind. At that point, the original event is no longer what is consuming your energy. Your attention is. One of the most remarkable characteristics of the human brain is that attention is not merely a passive process. It actively shapes the structure and function of neural circuits. Whatever repeatedly captures your focus becomes more familiar, more accessible, and more influential over time. This is one of the reasons habits become automatic. The brain strengthens pathways that are used frequently while allowing less active pathways to weaken. In other words, attention is constantly telling your nervous system what matters. This has enormous implications for emotional health. If your attention repeatedly returns to criticism, conflict, or disrespect, your brain gradually becomes more efficient at detecting those experiences. It starts scanning the environment for signs of danger even when no immediate threat exists. A delayed text message begins to feel like rejection. Constructive feedback feels like personal failure. Someone else's success feels like evidence of your own inadequacy. The world itself hasn't necessarily changed. Your attentional system has simply become trained to prioritize negative information. This process is largely automatic because the brain naturally gives greater weight to potential threats than to neutral experiences. From an evolutionary perspective, missing a danger carried greater consequences than overlooking something pleasant. As a result, negative events often leave stronger impressions than positive ones. But although this bias is built into the nervous system, it is not fixed. The way you direct your attention every day influences how strongly that bias affects your thoughts and behavior. This is where the concept of ignoring becomes much more sophisticated than people often assume. Ignoring does not mean pretending reality doesn't exist. It does not mean denying problems or avoiding responsibility. It means making an intentional decision about where your limited cognitive resources will be invested. Every moment you spend engaging with unnecessary conflict is a moment your brain cannot devote to learning a skill, solving a meaningful problem, strengthening relationships, or improving your health. Attention has an opportunity cost. Every focus on one thing is simultaneously a decision not to focus on something else. Think about someone who reacts to every criticism online. Every comment demands a response. Every disagreement becomes a debate. Every misunderstanding becomes an opportunity to defend themselves. Over time, their daily routine becomes organized around managing other people's opinions. They may believe they are protecting their reputation, but from the perspective of the nervous system, something else is happening. Their brain is learning that external approval is the highest priority. As a result, emotional stability becomes increasingly dependent on factors they cannot control. Now imagine a different approach. The criticism appears. You notice it. Your brain generates the familiar impulse to respond immediately. But instead of acting on that impulse, you pause and ask a simple question. Will engaging with this improve my life, my work, or the people I care about? If the answer is no, you allow your attention to return to what you were doing before. At first, this feels surprisingly difficult, because the emotional centers of the brain continue signaling that the issue remains unresolved. But each time you redirect your attention voluntarily, you strengthen your ability to control where your mind goes, rather than allowing circumstances to decide for you. This ability is one of the defining characteristics of psychological resilience. Resilient individuals are not protected from disappointment, criticism, or failure. They experience the same emotional reactions as everyone else. The difference is that they recover more quickly because they don't repeatedly feed the neural circuits associated with those experiences. They acknowledge what happened, extract whatever lesson is useful, and then redirect attention toward actions that move them forward. Another important aspect of ignoring is that it changes the relationship between emotion and behavior. Many people assume that if they feel something strongly, they must act on it immediately. But emotions are signals, not instructions. Anger may indicate that a boundary has been crossed. Fear may indicate uncertainty. Frustration may reveal that expectations were not met. These signals contain valuable information, but they do not automatically prescribe the correct response. Sometimes the most intelligent action is immediate engagement. Other times the most intelligent action is deliberate non-engagement. There is also a physiological benefit to this approach. Every unnecessary conflict activates stress-related systems in the body. Heart rate increases, breathing patterns change, muscles tense, and attention narrows toward the perceived threat. If this state becomes frequent, the nervous system spends more time preparing for conflict than recovering from it. Chronic activation of these systems can reduce mental clarity, impair decision-making, and make it increasingly difficult to focus on meaningful work. By choosing not to engage with situations that offer little value, you allow your nervous system more opportunities to return to a balanced state. Perhaps the most powerful outcome of selective attention is that it gradually changes your identity. Instead of seeing yourself as someone who must respond to everything, you begin seeing yourself as someone who chooses deliberately where to invest energy. Your confidence no longer depends on winning every argument or correcting every misunderstanding. It comes from knowing that your attention is one of your most valuable biological resources, and you refuse to spend it carelessly. When you consistently practice this, something subtle but profound begins to happen. The people, events, and opinions that once dominated your thoughts start losing their influence. Not because they disappeared, but because you stopped reinforcing them. In their place, your brain creates stronger pathways around purpose, learning, discipline, and meaningful action. The world becomes quieter, not because there is less noise around you, but because you have trained your nervous system to recognize that not everything deserves a place inside your mind. There is a common belief that influence comes primarily from speaking well, having the perfect argument, or always knowing exactly what to say. But if you observe people who consistently remain composed in difficult situations, you'll notice something different. Their strength is often communicated long before they begin speaking. It is reflected in their posture, their breathing, the pace of their movements, and their willingness to remain silent when everyone else feels compelled to react. This is not simply a personality trait. It is the outward expression of a nervous system that has learned to remain stable under pressure. Silence is frequently misunderstood because many people associate it with weakness, avoidance, or uncertainty. In reality, silence can represent one of the highest forms of self-regulation. When someone criticizes you, challenges your decisions, or attempts to provoke an emotional response, the immediate urge is to defend yourself. That urge originates from biological systems designed to protect you from perceived threats. But protection does not always require action. Sometimes the most effective protection comes from refusing to allow another person's emotions to dictate your own behavior. Think about how conflict typically unfolds. One person raises their voice, the other interrupts. Accusations become louder, explanations become longer, and each individual becomes increasingly focused on proving they are right. At that point, the conversation is no longer driven by curiosity or understanding. It is driven by emotional escalation. Each reaction reinforces the next until both nervous systems become locked into a cycle of stress and defensiveness. Now imagine that same situation unfolding differently. Someone attempts to provoke you. They expect frustration, anger, or immediate resistance. Instead, you remain calm. You maintain steady breathing. You listen without rushing to fill every moment with words. Your response, if you choose to give one at all, is brief, intentional, and emotionally neutral. From the outside, it may appear that very little happened. From the perspective of your nervous system, however, something extraordinary has occurred. You have prevented another person's emotional state from becoming your own. This ability has profound effects on how other people perceive you. Human beings constantly interpret nonverbal signals. Long before we analyze someone's words, we unconsciously evaluate their level of confidence, emotional stability, and self-control through facial expression, body language, tone of voice, and behavioral consistency. A person who remains composed during conflict communicates something powerful without needing to announce it. They demonstrate that their internal state is not easily controlled by external circumstances. One reason this matters is that emotional regulation is often contagious. Just as panic can spread quickly through a group, calm can also influence the emotional state of others. When one individual refuses to contribute additional emotional intensity, the entire interaction begins to change. The pace slows, the conversation becomes less reactive. Even if the other person remains upset, they no longer receive the emotional fuel that often sustains unnecessary conflict. There is another important principle at work. The brain constantly attempts to predict outcomes based on previous experiences. If people learn that every criticism produces an immediate emotional response from you, they begin expecting that pattern. Your reactions become predictable. But when your behavior remains measured and consistent, those expectations begin to disappear. Others realize that provoking you no longer guarantees the response they anticipated. In many situations, this alone significantly reduces future conflict because the reward for provoking you has been removed. Consistency also plays a critical role in developing genuine confidence. Many people confuse confidence with certainty or dominance. They believe confidence means always having the final word or always convincing others that they are correct. But true confidence operates differently. It is rooted in internal stability rather than external agreement. A confident person does not require every misunderstanding to be corrected immediately because their sense of identity is not dependent on constant validation. They understand that reputation is built through repeated actions over time, not through winning isolated arguments. Consider the cumulative effect of your daily choices. Every moment you remain calm, instead of reacting impulsively, you reinforce a pattern. Every unnecessary argument you choose not to enter preserves mental energy. Every criticism you evaluate objectively instead of emotionally strengthens your capacity for rational thinking. These individual moments may seem insignificant, but the nervous system adapts through repetition. Small decisions, repeated consistently, gradually become automatic behaviors. This process also changes how you experience stress. Instead of viewing every disagreement as a threat requiring immediate action, your brain begins recognizing that many situations resolve naturally without your intervention. You become less sensitive to distractions that once consumed your attention. Emotional recovery becomes faster because you spend less time replaying conversations or imagining alternative outcomes. The result is not emotional numbness, it is emotional efficiency. Your mind becomes better at distinguishing between what deserves engagement and what simply deserves distance. Silence also creates something that constant talking cannot: observation. When you are not busy preparing your next response, you begin noticing details that would otherwise be missed. You recognize patterns in people's behavior. You identify motivations behind their words. You become more aware of your own emotional state before it begins influencing your decisions. Observation provides information, and information improves judgment. In many cases, the person who speaks the least learns the most because their attention remains available rather than consumed by self-expression. Perhaps the greatest advantage of measured silence is that it shifts your focus from controlling other people to controlling yourself. You stop measuring success by whether someone agrees with you, apologizes, or changes their opinion. Instead, success becomes maintaining alignment between your actions and your values, regardless of what others choose to do. That shift is transformative because it places your emotional well-being back under your own control. Over time, people begin recognizing this quality without you ever announcing it. They notice that you do not react impulsively, that you are thoughtful rather than defensive, and that your decisions remain consistent even under pressure. Your presence begins communicating reliability before your words ever do. And that is the remarkable paradox. The less you feel compelled to prove your strength through constant explanation or emotional reaction, the more evident your strength becomes. Your silence is no longer empty. It becomes a reflection of discipline, clarity, and a nervous system that has learned the rare ability to remain steady while the world around it continues demanding a reaction. If this changed the way you think, don't let it end here. The real transformation begins the next time life gives you a reason to react and you choose not to. Remember, every moment you control your attention, you strengthen your mind. Every unnecessary reaction you avoid is another step toward becoming emotionally unshakable. Thanks for watching Brain Upgrade. If you found this valuable, subscribe for more neuroscience-based insights on building a stronger, calmer, and more disciplined mind. Until next time, protect your attention, train your brain, and keep upgrading yourself.